When I was here last, I talked about, hey, it's working, the discovery of Sodom, or the search for Sodom. What led us to the site, and I'll do a quick review on that. Tonight, though, the main topic is going to be the destruction of Sodom. So, Tal el-Hammam is the site where we are excavating. We've been excavating there since 2005. It is north of the Dead Sea, on the right-hand or eastern edge of the circular plain at the end of the Dead Sea, that in Scripture is called Hakikar Har-Yaden. Ha is the word the. Kikar means circle. It appears some 68 times in the Scripture, and it usually describes a disc of metal, a coin, usually translated talent, like a talent of silver or gold in Scripture. Especially the King James Version, that's where the word talent comes from. Or it's describing basically a tortilla, a flat, round loaf of bread. That's its common usage. But in Genesis chapter 13, where we get more geographical clues for the location of Sodom than even for Jerusalem by a factor of 3, all right? It's referred to, that plain, that circular plain, is referred to as Hakikar. Only in Genesis chapter 13, 13 appearances of the word kikar, does it refer to a piece of real estate. And as I asked the last time, if everywhere else, and it's used not only in the Scriptures, but in every Semitic language, even Egyptian, has a form of the word kikar or kakar. Right? If it always means a flat piece of bread, tortilla, or pita bread, or a flat round coin, when they apply that term to real estate, what do you think that piece of real estate looks like? Flat, circular. And that's what the kikar looks like, flat, circular. Okay? Har-Yaden is not translated anywhere in Scripture. It's transliterated. In other words, they just substitute our alphabet for the Hebrew alphabet, and it comes out the Jordan. Yarden comes out Jordan. It's used as a proper name. But what it means is the descent. And what they're talking about is the descent from the Sea of Galilee in the north to the Dead Sea in the south. It's a difference in elevation over I'm sorry, I can only talk in meters or kilometers because that's the metric system we use there. 65 kilometers from the south end of the Sea of Galilee to the north end of the Dead Sea. A descent of 800 feet. That is the descent, the Yarden. But it gets used as a proper name, the Jordan, in Scripture. So Hakikar Har-Yaden is translated in Scripture, the plain of Jordan. So when you see that phrase, that's what you're seeing. And by the way, even in Israel right now, you know what they call traffic circles? Kikar. They still use that word to describe a circle. So that's where we are. So what I talked about the last time is that Tal el-Hammam, which is the site we're excavating on the eastern edge of the Kikar, I'll use that term, of the Kikar, it's the right place. And we were led to that place from Genesis chapter 13. Because that's where all the geographical clues, and I'm not going to go through that detail again. Go home and read it. And it'll tell you exactly from where you're starting at Bethel and I, where to look and where to find it. And that's what Dr. Collins did, and that's where we found a site that at least was in the location described. Was it Sodom? We don't know. We haven't found the Chamber of Commerce Welcome to Sodom sign yet. But we found a big site. All right? So it was in the right place. It's at the right time. And by that, in fact, I'm getting a little ahead. And the thing we're going to do tonight is, does it also tell the right story? Let me go back to that one more time, because I blew by it. Okay, does Tal el-Hammam tell the right story? That's what we're going to focus on tonight. Last time we talked about right place, right time, right stuff. So now I can go ahead. Okay, in terms of the right place, go to Genesis chapter 13. Read it. You'll find all the geographical clues you need to find the place. The problem is, early archaeologists were not Bible believers for the most part, and they ignored chapter 13, and they ended up looking in the wrong place for the wrong stuff and never found it. And that just fed the whole mindset that came out of Germany in the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th century that said, well, they were trying to answer the question, where did our Bible come from? And so they tried to figure out, where did the Bible come from? Who wrote it? When was it written? And they came up with what's called the documentary hypothesis. And out of that scholarship came a belief that you can't trust any of the books, certainly not the Pentateuch, because we don't have, at that time, early 19th century, first half of the 19th century, we don't have any external evidence to the Bible that any of these people existed or that any of these places existed. So it's all just based on myth and legend. And that philosophy took root in theological schools and in theological thinking throughout all of Europe, and it came right to America. And that position, that mindset, still persists today, unfortunately, in seminaries, among pastors, theologians. There's a lot of Bible teachers out there who think that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are all based on myth and legend. And that they were written in 600 BC by a bunch of Judahite priests who compiled it all together to basically justify the existence of Israel in the land. That's hogwash. I'll just say it flat out. You may as well paint the barn with it, because it just doesn't fly. I think pigs will fly first. Thank you for those of you, few of you who laughed. Okay, anyway, where was I? Okay, so there's your geographical clues. It's in the right place. But now the question is, when we look at it, that's the passages, the key passages. He went up from the Negev to a place between Bethel and Ai. Lot looked up. He saw the whole plain of the Jordan. Lot looked up, set his eyes towards the east, and he headed out. So where did they start from? Bethel and Ai. What direction did he look in? East. Where did he set out? Towards the east. And he pitched his camp on the plain, the Kikar, near Sodom. Not in the city, but near Sodom. Why? Because he had a lot of livestock with him. Sheep, goats, and who knows what all else. So he camps around the city of Sodom. All right, there's Bethel and Ai. You're looking kind of to the southeast. That body of water is the North Basin of the Dead Sea. Bethel and Ai is about 12 or 14 kilometers north of Jerusalem, and that's where they're setting in the scripture. Oh man, I hit the wrong thing. There we go, wrong button, sorry. He looks to the east. He sees the Kikar in the circle. There's that circular plain at the north end of the Dead Sea. North is to the left here. And he heads to Sodom on the far side. And yes, you can see Sodom from Bethel and Ai. You can actually see it from Jerusalem too, oh, by the way. And we can see Jerusalem from Tal el-Hammam. All right, now, in terms of the right time, Sodom is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 belongs to the archaeological period that we call the early Bronze Age. Refer to the timeline, early Bronze Age. And Sodom is described as one of the border cities of Canaan. And the border cities of Canaan are listed. Okay, there's basically the timeline. Early Bronze Age is up at the top, intermediate in the middle, Middle Bronze Age, below that, Late Bronze Age, and then finally Iron Age. That's basically where most of the Old Testament takes place. In fact, all of the Old Testament takes place there. Starts in the early Bronze Age, takes us up through the Iron Age. To give you a timeline, Abraham, all the Abraham narratives occur in the Middle Bronze Age. The Late Bronze Age is the period of wandering the Exodus, the period of wandering in the desert. It includes the period of the Judges. So you're talking about 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. As you get towards the seconds of Chronicles and Kings, now what you're getting into is you're at the beginning of the Iron Age. Saul, David, Solomon. Saul and David for sure are bridging that gap from the end of the Late Bronze period into the beginning of the Iron Age. Solomon is solidly Iron Age. Okay, and then the rest of the New Testament is the rest of the New Testament with all the prophets and everything is occurring during the Iron Age. After the Iron Age, we get into the whole, actually there's a little bit, it does come beyond that. The Old Testament, we also get into what's referred to as Iron Age 3. Iron Age 3 is also referred to as the Persian period. Goes by two names, the Persian period. Who does that remind you of? Cyrus the Great. All right? So you've got, at the end of the Iron Age, you've got the people being taken out of Israel. You got, first of all, Israel to the north is taken out in the end of the Iron Age, and then you start getting into Iron Age 3. Then Babylon takes out Judah, and it's during that period of time that they spend 70 years in Babylon, and then they come back, rebuild the temple. That gets us now into that period. Once we get out of the Old Testament during the intertestamental period, that's known as the Hellenistic Age. Alexander the Great, he conquers the world. And so when you get into the New Testament, what's all the influence? It's Greek. The New Testament's written in Greek. Okay, that's the Hellenistic period. And then you get, after the Hellenistic period, what you get into now is, notice there's a shift in Iron Age 3 from metallurgy, Bronze Age, Iron Age. Before that was the Copper Age. All right? You get a shift in Iron Age 3 from metallurgy to political powers. Notice it's named the Persian period. After that, the Hellenistic period. After that, the Roman period. Okay, so there's a shift. So all that's on the timeline. You can look at that later. But now, Genesis chapter 10 occurs in the early Bronze Age. They're naming the border cities of Canaan, and named among them are Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. So that tells us that we have to have a functioning city to be named as a border city of Canaan during the early Bronze Age. All the Abraham narratives take place towards the second half of the Middle Bronze Age. So, Genesis 19:1, when the two angels go looking for Sodom to scope it out before it gets destroyed, where do they find Lot seating? In chapter 19, verse 1. He's seated at the city gate. That means we've got a fortified city with a city gate. So, Sodom has to exist in the early Bronze Age as a city, to be named as a border city. It has to exist in the Middle Bronze Age as a fortified city with a city gate. All right? Tal al-Hammam, the architecture, it meets both of those criteria. In fact, it was continuously occupied from its initial settlement at the end of the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, which is about 4500 BC, and it was continuously occupied from 4500 BC right up until its destruction in the middle of the late Bronze, the middle of the second half of the Middle Bronze Age, around 1650 BC. So you've got this very long period of continuous occupation. So it meets the time criteria. There's a picture of some of the excavation. The yellow is an early Bronze Age foundation wall for the outer city defense system. The pink band going from top to bottom to top is the Middle Bronze Age foundation. They had a walled city during the early Bronze Age. In the Middle Bronze Age, they doubled the thickness of the wall so that basically you're looking at the combined width now of the vertical city wall going all the way around the site, and then extending out at a slope from the base of that wall. It extended out 136 feet in what's called a rampart, a sloped earthen, in this case, mud brick structure that made it very difficult for an invading army to assault the city wall because they had to fight their way up the slope to get there. So they couldn't get siege equipment. They couldn't get battering rams up it. So massive city. Now that pink on the left, that's the foundation of one of the main towers that flanked the city gate. The city gate is actually at the bottom of that picture. We hadn't quite uncovered it at this point. We uncovered it at the following season when we took that picture. Now, it also has the right stuff. The architecture of Sodom, especially in the Middle Bronze Age, is truly monumental. You saw the thickness of those walls. Those walls, just for the fortification walls, each wall, the early Bronze Age, is, what would you say, dear, about 15 feet? Where are you? There you are. You're standing up. It's about 15 feet. So you got about 30 feet of foundation walls, which were massive, mud brick on top of it at one point. The foundation walls of the palace on the upper tell, and you'll if you don't know what I'm talking about, you will soon, is 2.3 meters. It's 6, 8, almost 9 feet thick. It's about a little over 8 feet thick, the foundation walls. That's big enough to support a 5-story building, mud brick building. So monumental architecture, and the same thing was true of the temple foundation that we found on the lower tell, 2.6 meters. Big buildings. This was a big city, 64 acres inside the perimeter of that defensive wall going around the whole site. More than 100 acres, including the little villages and all the people that worked the fields outside of the city gates, outside of the city walls. Little villages all around where the people that worked the fields lived. More than 100 acres involved in this thing. This is a big city. Jerusalem, by the way, was never more than 12 acres inside their fortified walls. This is much bigger now, but the fortified Jerusalem was about 12 acres. We're talking about a 64-acre inside the city wall, big city. In the Middle Bronze Age, there was only one other site in all of the Levant that was close to it in size, and that's Hatzor, up by the Sea of Galilee. And those two cities controlled the north-south trade routes. Hatzor in the north, Tal al-Hammam, Sodom, in the south. And across the valley, the east-west trade route, Tal al-Hammam at the crossroads, Jericho on the other side of the valley. They controlled the east-west trade route coming down from Jordan, from Amman, Jordan. The Ammonites, coming down from the Ammonites to get across up to Jerusalem, they had to go right through, right by Tal al-Hammam. They had to go right by Jericho to get up the other side. So major trade routes crisscrossing the valley here. And Tal al-Hammam sits right at the crossroads of the major north-south, east-west trade route. And it's also got the right stuff. When we look at the material evidence, again, I already mentioned the gate. There's Genesis 19:1. Lot was seated at the city gate. The city of the Sodom is fortified. That's what that tells us. And it is fortified heavily. Here's a picture. Now, looking from the upper tell down to the lower tell, you're looking at the city gate, all right, that we excavated in season 8. Where's my pointer? There's my pointer. Okay. Here's the city gate right here. Here's that tower foundation that I pointed out earlier. The other one's over here, but it's under these trees. We never uncovered it because that's a very tight root system. And kind of in the middle of that lower tell is what we call the sacred area or the sacred precinct. That's where we found the temple foundation in the lower city. And this is our architect's reconstruction of what that gate might have looked like. Okay, big. He shows here a 4-story tower. It could have been 5, it could have been more. We're not sure. Okay, big. City gate, main entrance into the city. Here's a just quick shot. Some of the pottery, very uniquely decorated. This is typical decoration on the left here of Middle Bronze Age pottery, hand-painted. This is very untypical or atypical, technically, pottery that we find only in the palace. If this is Sodom, that's King Bera's palace. He had a very special finish to all of his pottery that is known nowhere else in the Levant And we've checked with over 100 different archaeologists. Nobody has ever seen anything like this. Just absolutely amazing. Here's some more examples of Middle Bronze Age pottery that we find all over the site, except for that special finish. That special finish is only in the palace. Here's a montage of that special finish as it appears on different potteries. Lots of different color. We call this multi-slip, cross-wiped palaceware because we only find it in the palace. Very unique, only exists there, but it's all over the palace in broken pieces. All over the palace. So, it's got the right stuff. I mean, Sodom is portrayed as a big city. We got a big city. It's portrayed as an influential city. We obviously have an influential city seated at the crossroads of the trade routes. The scripture tells us exactly where to find it. We're sitting in that bullseye, where it's supposed to be. So, the conclusion is, Tal al-Hammam, right place, right time, right stuff, but does it tell the right story? What's the story of Sodom? Give me the concluding chapter. What's the story of Sodom? The destruction. God wipes it out. Okay? Does it tell that story? Does Tal al-Hammam tell us the right story? Now, Dr. Collins, who is our dig director, for 20 years, he's been talking about Tal al-Hammam being the right place, right time, right stuff. My focus, my personal research focus has been, does it tell the right story? So I euphemistically say, I'm telling the Paul Harvey version of the story. How many know Paul Harvey? The rest of the story, come on. I'm telling the rest of the story. It's the Paul Harvey version. All right, there you go. Thank you. Phew. Stunned silence. I could hear the crickets chirping there. All right, and what is the story? Yeah, we're talking about the destruction of the city. Does it tell that story? So, it's found in Genesis 19. The whole story of the destruction event is only 2 verses in the whole Bible. Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25. Now, the story goes on to the end of almost the end of the chapter until up through verse 28, where you find the next day after the event, some events in there. So you can go and read that if you want. But at any rate, it's in 2 verses, and this is what the 2 verses say. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew on the ground. So, what happened? That's what happened. Out of the heavens rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of the heavens, and he overthrew. So that's what happened. But what was the extent of what happened? Here's the extent. All of the cities, the entire plain, all of the inhabitants, and everything that grew upon the ground, toast, wiped out. So this is not just a single site event, according to this passage. This is an area-wide event. It says the entire plain was destroyed. Not just the residents of Sodom, but the residents of all of the cities were destroyed. All of the cities were overthrown. And I can't emphasize that enough. It wasn't just a single site event. It was an area-wide event. Okay? So hold that thought. That's what the scripture tells us we should be looking for. Nobody, and I can say this with confidence because I did the research, nobody before my doctoral dissertation ever considered the area-wide implications of this destruction event. Everybody was focused on Sodom. Pick up any commentary you want on this passage, and they may talk about Sodom. They'll probably tell you it's in the wrong place. Nobody comments on the fact that it was an area-wide destruction. Okay. So what was the extent of the destruction. What did we find? Well, there's the key car highlighted there. And what we've got highlighted by all those red and magenta circles, or whatever they look like from your angle, those are the most dominant known archaeological sites on the key car. Now, this is the Jordan River coming down from Jericho, way over here somewhere. The final approach across the key car, this is the key car, highlighted in green, dumps into the north end of the Dead Sea here. Note, this is the Israel side of the river. It's the so-called Cisjordan side, the near side. How many sites do you see there? One, Jericho. That's because there's only one major spring on that side. And without water, you don't have a city. There's only one, and Jericho sits on it. There are 7 known springs, plus a whole bunch of wadis, arroyos, washes, whatever you want to call them, come down from the Jordan Plateau, well watered on the right-hand side. I've only shown here the main sites. There have been documented over 120 sites on that trans-Jordan side, the other side of the Jordan, Israel being the reference point. But a lot of them were just seasonal encampments used by shepherds as they grazed their sheep during the winter months when they brought them all down from the highlands, because the Kikar has its own microclimate. It's relatively pleasant there during the winter. And so they bring their sheep down, they graze them. So some of them were just seasonal encampments, but these are actually settlements. And Tal al-Hammam is that big 600-pound gorilla you see there on the right side. Okay, big site compared to the rest of them. Now, the question is, how many urban centers were there in the late Bronze Age? This gets us to the period now after the destruction. How many sites are there? Jericho, but only briefly, only for a few decades. And the only reason it was there is we had the last incursion of the Egyptians into the southern Levant during the late Bronze Age, about the middle of it, and they built a small settlement on the site of Jericho and a customs house so that they could collect taxes from the caravans that still traversed the valley floor. And they also built not a settlement, but a customs house on Tal al-Hammam that was identical to the one in Jericho so that they could collect taxes from us. But there was no settlement there. At best, all they had was a tent garrison of Egyptian soldiers to help enforce the tax collection. There's no other architecture there in the late Bronze Age except for that one tariff house, that one building. There's nothing there. But yet, all of those other cities circled around, those are the other big urban centers that are up on the plateau, out above the Kikar, outside of the Kikar. They kept going without a hiccup right into the late Bronze Age. They did not experience this destruction. But yet, what happened there? That's the big question mark. What happened to take all of those sites, by the way, including Jericho, offline in the Middle Bronze Age? That's what we call the destruction of Sodom, but not just a single site event, a regional event. And I did the research on this. I looked at the surveys. 4 of those sites, including Tal al-Hammam, have been excavated. I read all the excavation reports. They all say the same thing. Evidence of occupation on many of these sites that goes back to the Neolithic period, 4500 BC. Evidence of occupation, sometimes interrupted, sometimes not. At Tal al-Hammam, not. At Tel Kafrain, not. At Tel Nimreen, not interrupted. That tells Bible and Musta, not interrupted. Those are the ones that have been surveyed or excavated intensely. Just continuous occupation. Then all of a sudden, boom, everybody's off site. And there's a gap of 600 to 700 years in the occupation on the east side. Remember I said Jericho is about 350-year gap before the Egyptians came back in and built their little settlement for about 3 or 4 decades at Jericho. By the way, it was that settlement that Joshua took out. Think about that. Okay, that was the settlement that Joshua took out. All right? But in this area, Everybody went offline. And for about 600 years, we discovered up on this side, before people started moving back in again, 700 years at Tal al-Hammam before people started moving again. So we've got this. That period, by the way, is the entire late Bronze Age in the Kikar timeline again. Okay, that's the whole late Bronze period. Nobody home except shepherds trying to graze their crops on whatever they graze their flocks rather on whatever they could find. All right? I'm sorry, speak up loud.
Were the trade routes still being used?
Oh yes, the caravans kept going. That's why the Egyptians built those 2 custom houses. The caravans kept going, but there was a period of time where there was nobody home to collect anything until the middle of the late Bronze period. And by the way, the late Bronze period is when the Exodus occurred. That's a whole nother lecture. I'll just leave it hanging there. But the Exodus occurred during the late Bronze period, and I'll just give you the conclusion of it. When Moses led the people, after 38 years of wandering in the Negev, the south part of the Levant, after 38 years of wandering around, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night lifted up and started leading them around the south end of the Dead Sea. Moses tried to cross through Edom. They said, go around. So he went around. He tried to cross through Moab. They said, go around. So he went out onto the western edge of the great Arabian desert and went up the Old King's Highway till he got to Ammon. He tried to cut down through to get into the Kikar and they said, go around. Well, to go around, he would have to go almost a third of the way up to the Sea of Galilee, to the Wadi Zerka, to get down in there. And he said, baloney. And what does he do? He takes on the Ammonites, and he cleans their clock. And then he makes his way down below Pisgah, which is another name for Mount Nebo, that area. And he settles on a place called Abel Shittim. Now, wonder of wonders, almost all theologians and archaeologists agree that Abel Shittim is Tal al-Hammam. Okay, just file that back away again. The rest of that's another lecture for another time. All right, so that's the upper tell of Tal al-Hammam. You're looking at it from the hill across. See this highway down the bottom? We're right at the edge of the Great Rift Valley. So once you get across this road, it starts to climb up to the Jordan Plateau up above. So we're right on the eastern edge of the Kikar. This is the upper tell. The lower tell, you can't really see it. It's down here. This valley floor underneath, by the way, this big cut here, that's mud brick rampart wall on the upper tell that they gouged out of with bulldozers to reconstitute this field down here. Okay, and it's very heavily agricultural around us. The whole lower tell, almost the entire lower tell is given over to agriculture now. But from this level to the height of the broad, flat lower tell, it's 100 feet difference, 30 meters. And from the lower tell to here, the top of the upper tell, it's another 100 feet. So from down here to the top here, it's a 200-foot climb, and you can see that's very, very steep. All right? So that's the view. All right, so we got some facts that we have to deal with, and that print is too small for me to read there, so I'm going to come down and talk to the back of your heads. All right, so what's the first fact? There was a Bronze Age civilization occupying the Kikar. There's no doubt about that. The survey evidence, the archaeological evidence tells us. It was not just Tal al-Hammam, but the entire Kikar. We had a whole civilization occupying the Kikar. We estimate somewhere between 45,000 and 65,000 people lived in the Kikar. Tal al-Hammam was its cultural center. It's the 600-pound gorilla on the Kikar. The next largest site is only 1/4 the size of Tal al-Hammam, and that's Tel Nimreen, which, by the way, we believe is Admah. We can't prove it. No Chamber of Commerce welcome to Admah sign either. But we think it's Admah. All right? And it flourished continuously, without interruption, for 2,500 years. Second fact, that Bronze Age civilization, including Tal al-Hammam, came to abrupt termination toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And the area remained unoccupied for the next 7 centuries. Nobody home. Now, when you think about the history of Sodom and the way it's described in Scripture and how it got destroyed, kind of one of the first explanations for why was nobody home for that long? Bad juju. Would you want to live on a piece of real estate that God torched? No, it wasn't bad juju. But is there a physical reason? We'll get to that. So, the critical question is, what happened? This was the best watered agriscape in the entire Middle East. It's described in Genesis chapter 13 as being watered like Egypt. How was Egypt watered? The Nile River. Annual inundation of the Nile River, flooded. And then as the waters would recede, they'd plant their crops and then they'd dry farm and harvest before the fall rains came in. Right? Best watered agriscape. Nobody's living there. And it says that when Lot in chapter 13 is looking across, and he says, yeah, the Kikar is watered just like Egypt. And he says, like the Garden of God. Garden of God. I can't say that fast. I'm handicapped by the language. How was Eden watered? Springs. A river ran through it. And the mist of the evening. Right? Jordan River. It's like the Nile in miniature. It used to flood, just like the Nile River. And it would spread out about a third of the way across take out the whole middle third of the Kikar would be flooded. And as the waters receded, they'd plant their crops, just like in Egypt. Dry farm, harvest before the fall rains. Also, I've already mentioned, we had 7 known springs on the east side, 1 major spring on the west side for Jericho. Yeah, perfect. Why did it get abandoned for all that time? Got to answer that question eventually. Okay, so there have been a lot of theories of destruction, of what happened to Sodom, based on a reading of the text. Those 2 verses, remember? Okay? And I'm just going to give you the top 3. Right. The first one is assuming that the destruction of Sodom was a purely natural event. No God. You don't need God. It was all myth and legend anyway. You don't need God. It was a purely natural event. That's not my opinion, by the way. Okay, that's the opinion of the others that I described earlier, coming out of Germany and taking over the United States and all of Europe. Okay, purely natural event. A severe earthquake occurred, accompanied by eruptions of petrocarbon emissions. In other words, methane, gas, natural gas, whatever. Well, you know what? We don't have any of that in the Kikar. Now, we do have eruptions of pitch, of bitumen, that come up from the deep basin of the northern basin of the Dead Sea. In fact, Josephus, how many of you heard of Josephus? Okay, Josephus was a historian writing for the Romans. He writes an article about the sites down at the south end of the Dead Sea, that they always knew when the Dead Sea was about to burp balls of bitumen. Because for 3 or 4 days before they would appear floating on the surface of the water, there would be a terrible stench of rotten eggs. Sulfur dioxide, right? And that was so strong that it would tarnish the silverware in the drawers. Can you imagine living in that? Blech. And then, after 3 or 4 days, these balls of bitumen, which is pitch, remember what Noah coated the ark with was bitumen. What do? You boil it down, and you can paintbrush it on and seal things. It would come floating to the top, and they'd get out in the little rowboats, and they would go collect the balls and use them for what you use bitumen for. All right? And as soon as they appeared on the surface, the stench would go away until the next time. Okay? So, yeah, there was that, but other than sulfur dioxide, there was never any mention of any ignition In fact, there is no known ignition of petrochemical gas coming out of the ground and spontaneously igniting. No documented evidence of it. But that was a theory. Well, okay, it's possible, maybe, theoretically, but an open-air ignition of that volume of gas, there's nothing to contain it, there's no explosive force. You get a big fireball, but there's no explosive force, and that doesn't explain the fact that at the site, we find at the lower tell, no mud brick superstructures. They're all gone. The only thing that's left in the ground are the stone foundations. When I say mud brick superstructures, are you familiar with the adobe on the Indian pueblos, especially in New Mexico and other places? Stone foundation, adobe brick. That's how they built in the Bronze Age. Same way. They built much bigger, but same thing. No superstructures. No superstructures. No walls. Just foundation walls in the ground. Uncut field stones. So it doesn't explain where they're missing. And it doesn't explain, especially on the upper tell, but we also see evidence of this on the lower tell, that all of the debris was pushed in one direction, from southwest to northeast. Where is the Great Rift Valley? It's a giant crack in the earth, right? And that crack in the earth is what we call a strike-slip crack. You've got the Asian plate and the European plates grinding against each other. Now, they're both heading generally north, but one is moving a little faster than the other. And so when they let go, slip, you get a major earthquake. We're in one of the more tectonically active areas of the world, except for maybe the Pacific Rim. When they slip, there's a big earthquake. But in this region, because it's a north-south strike-slip zone, when they slip, all of the seismic waves are going like this. Building walls go like this. And they're either going to fall that way, or they're going to fall this way, or they're going to fall both. Bidirectional, in other words. We don't have that at Tel El-Mom. It's all going one way, not two ways. So whatever took them out, earthquake didn't do it. Theory number 2. Well, tectonic shift occurred again, earthquake zone. And by what they call here is that, the tectonic shift occurred. Basically, instead of going this way, which is the way they go, it went this way momentarily, dropped Sodom into the chasm, and then crashed over it. That's the other main theory. So that Sodom, again, it's always in a single city reference, Sodom got swallowed up in the crack. Well, there's some problems with that theory too. Okay? It fails to account for the fact that there was a thriving Middle Bronze Age civilization occupying the entire Kikar. That's what the evidence shows. And what does Genesis 19 say about the destruction? They all got wiped out. So why are we still finding them if they all got swallowed up by the earth opening up and swallowing them? Secondly, where that crack is, where it opens up, it's the deepest place on the surface of the earth. They didn't have indoor plumbing like we have indoor plumbing. Where does the refuse go? It flows downhill. If you're living at the lowest place on earth, where's it going to flow? Would you build your city in a cesspool? That's why they build out towards the edges. Plus, remember, annually it would flood. You've got to get beyond the flood zone to build your cities. That's why all of the cities are around the outside of that circular plane. They're not in the middle. They're not stupid. But this suggestion sure is. All right. Third main option is that it was a totally divine event. Totally divine event. I would go with that too. But here's how they defined it. A fiery conflagration somehow miraculously blasted out of heaven. Oh, that's what the scripture said, right? Brimstone and fire came down from heaven. Okay. The problem with it, as stated, it turns God into a cosmic magician. He didn't like what was going on, so he goes zap. cosmic magician. That was not how the Israelites thought. The Israelites, and I'm going to repeat this later in the presentation, but I'll give you a sneak preview of it now. One God who created all things. Anybody got a problem with that? I don't, as a theologian. But they went on to say, who uses his creation to accomplish his purpose. He's no magician that goes zap. He's got a whole universe of stuff to use. And what does Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25 say? What did he use? Brimstone and fire. Brimstone's an unfortunate description. The two Hebrew words are gofrit and esh. Esh is fire. It's always translated fire in Scripture. Gofrit's the problem. It basically means rock. Sometimes it's translated brimstone, I think 16 times in Scripture, something like maybe less than that. The rest of the time it's translated lightning. Okay? Gofrit doesn't have a chemical composition requirement to it that demands it contain sulfur. But I can imagine the King James translators back in 1611, actually they stole the work from Tyndale, so it was probably him before them, and they burned him at the stake. We're sitting there reading this passage, and gofrit and ash came from God out of the heavens. Ash, no problem. Rock and fire. Fire and rock. Burning rock? What was the only burning rock they knew? Brimstone. So they translated it brimstone in this passage. That sent 4 generations of archaeologists looking for brimstone. Wrong stuff. And it took them to the wrong place. And that's why, by ignoring chapter 13, they never found Sodom. And that just reinforced the myth that the first 5 books of the Bible, and especially Genesis, dirty book, is all myth and legend. Because they never found it. Wrong place, looking for the wrong stuff. Or looking for the wrong stuff led to the wrong place. So, throw that one out the window too. Partially. Stay tuned. All right, what does the physical evidence say? When it gets right down to us, this whole excavation project is a scientific investigation. We're looking at the ground. We found it by looking at the Scripture, but everything we've done since then, this is a scientific project examining the evidence, interpreting the evidence to try and find out what does it tell us to help us understand better what the Scriptures are actually saying. Okay? That's really what true biblical archaeology is about. The Bible informs your archaeology. The Bible told us where to go look. We went looking and found it. But what we're finding now is helping us to illuminate the text. What does Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25 mean? We know what it says, but what does it mean? What really came out of the skies? What really happened on the ground? It's like could you write the history of the United States in 1 paragraph? I'll even give you 15 sentences. Can you do it? Sure you can. But you're going to leave a lot of stuff out. The whole destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain is 2 verses. It's the Cliff Notes version. It's the abbreviated form. They left a lot out. They just gave us the highlights. Here it is. We're trying to fill in the rest of the story, thank you, Paul Harvey, to understand what do those 2 verses mean. Okay, all right. So we've got, first of all, evidence of a highly concussive force. In other words, a big blast. Okay, that's what we mean by highly concussive force. That's Tal al-Habam from Google Earth. It looks like a crashed Starship Enterprise. You've got the lower tell is this more or less flat circular region down here. The upper tell is this long, narrow one, okay? So there's the upper tell right there. By the way, it's spelled tall. That's because in Arabic it's tall. In Israel, it's tell with 1 or 2 L's. Take your pick. but in Arabic it's tall. So I say Tal al-Hammam, not tall, but tall. Okay? T-A-H-L, tall. Okay, there's the lower tell. Now, the main city wall that I talked about actually goes around the outside perimeter of the whole thing. All right, I'm just showing that demarcation between the upper and the lower tell. There. Now, photograph was taken by a balloon shot in 2011. Now, on the lower tell, what we have found from the archaeological evidence is near total destruction. I've already mentioned no standing walls. In fact, no walls at all, except for a couple of small chunks that we found so far where a wall tipped over and unfortunately squashed 2 women and a kid, but a girl. But at any rate, by the way, we dig in 6-meter squares, 18 feet square. It takes 13,000 6-meter squares to cover that whole footprint. We have excavated maybe 100. Some of them we've just scratched the surface on. So, I mean, this site is so big, we will never excavate the whole thing in my lifetime, for sure. It's going to take multiple generations to excavate the whole thing if it ever happens, which probably won't, because that whole lower tell, as you can see from the scarring from this balloon shot, a big blast, a concussive force, like a bomb going off, the concussion that you feel from that high-pressure wave that you feel when a bomb goes off. That's what we mean by a concussive force. Okay? So on the lower tell, nothing to be found but foundations in the ground and what we can find within the foundations. Everything else is gone. It's like they took a putty knife and they scraped the whole tell right off. On the upper tell, near total destruction. Now, remember that first picture I showed you, that oblique picture, how steep those walls are? What we theorize is, as this concussive force moved out across the landscape, and I'll explain it later, it has to climb that slope. As it climbs that slope, it loses speed. So by the time it gets to the top, and oh, by the way, whatever projected above the city wall got sheared off. We do find remnants, especially in the palace, because the walls were so thick. We do find remnants at the top of the palace walls, the mud brick of the palace walls. But everything that was above the big upper city wall got sheared off, and that basically left a bowl on top that during the 600 years of no occupation, rain and wind eroded the mud brick remaining, and it all went into that bowl. If it didn't go off the sides, it went into that bowl and encapsulated. In other words, it covered, it buried all of the destruction evidence. And that's what we've been digging through to get down to it. Okay? See that light blue line? That's actually the upper city wall. You've got this long cigar-shaped upper tell, but the city at the top was very narrow because it's only flat, very narrow by the time you get up that city. It's very narrow. So that's the city wall we're talking about there. Do you have a question?
What would be the difference between this and a nuclear explosion?
A lot. Let's start with radioactivity. And the other question I will answer, if I don't answer it, get me the question after, but I will answer it. Okay? So that's really the upper city. Everything that stood above that wall, gone. Now, we also notice that when you look at those steep sides, that rampart wall that I described, when you look at the steep sides, there is more damage on the south side, which in this is the lower right, on the south side of the upper tell than there is on the back side of it, which suggests to us that the force of the concussive energy did more damage on that side than it did on the far side. That suggests directionality. In other words, that the force came from southwest of the site, traveling to the northeast. All right? So it suggests it. The other thing that we find as well on the upper tell, remember on the upper tell, we have some mud brick wall left behind, but we have a lot of debris. We call it the destruction matrix. And what that destruction matrix is, if you can imagine mud brick structures being hit by a huge bomb blast, even think a nuclear bomb for now, That's okay. By a huge bomb blast, what's it going to do to mud bricks? It's going to break it up into chunks. What's it going to do to a pottery vessel? Break it up into little pieces. We've got thousands. We collect. This is no exaggeration because we count them. We collect about 10,000 pieces. They're called sherds, as in pot sherds. Not shards, that's a piece of broken glass. They didn't have glass. Sherds. Broken pieces of pottery. We collect about 10,000 of them every season, which is on average 6 weeks long. Hold that thought, I'll get to it. Okay, if I don't get to it, remind me, but I will. All right. Of those 10,000, we catalog about 1,000 of them. And those are the ones we bring home for study each season. So about 1 in 10. And the ones that we catalog are called diagnostic sherds. In other words, it's a piece of a rim, a base, a handle, a spout, decoration, or something that can help tell us something about the form of the vessel, because from the form of the vessel, that's how we identify what archaeological period it belongs to. So we've got tens of thousands of sherds mixed up in a mixture of broken, pulverized mud brick, broken pottery, bones of people, fragments of bones, all like it was all put in a cuisinart and blown across the landscape. And when it encountered one of those walls on the upper tell, and by the way, notice the orientation is almost southwest to northeast, because that true north is straight up in that balloon shot there, in that image, or in the balloon shot. As it's traveling in that direction, when it encounters a wall, it banks up against the stub of that wall, but it also blows over that wall. And so when you look at the stub of that wall that's left now, and we do a cross-section of what we're digging through so that we can read the strata, the layering of all of this stuff getting blown across the landscape, we find it banked up, we find it blowing over and trailing away, and then if the wall was really big, we find depths as much as almost 2 meters, 6 feet, of this matrix material, like it's all been in a giant cuisinart. All traveling to the northeast. So again, evidence of directionality. Now, I think I lost track of where I was. Okay, so yeah, in the debris matrix, the destruction matrix, that's what I was just talking about there. So we've got those 2 points that suggest the directionality. Now, there's more. We have evidence of extreme high temperature. Here it comes. Okay, here it comes. This is, what do you think that is? Anybody ever hear of trinitite? The Trinity? Trinitite, the Trinity site in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where they detonated the first atomic bomb. The first time this piece of pottery came out of the ground, the reaction was, what is a piece of trinitite doing here? Trinitite is melted silica sand, and it's found at the base of the tower from which the bomb was suspended when they detonated it. It basically sucked up a tremendous volume of sand, and in the heat of that blast, it melted that sand, and it literally rained down in droplets that ranged sometimes as much as a 1/4 inch in diameter. Little spheres of melted sand raining down, and if it rained down in enough volumes, it literally puddled on the ground and made splotches of trinitite. In other cases, those spheres went high enough that they quenched, they solidified, they cooled enough to solidify before they hit the ground, and the ground is covered with beads of trinitite that vary in size, some of them up to a 1/4 inch, most of them smaller. Right. Same color green glass. The green coming from the copper wires that went up in the cables that connected to the bomb. Plus a lot of iron in it because the tower melted as well, the iron scaffolding that they hung the bomb from. So the first time, what's trinitite doing here? We took that piece down to New Mexico Tech in Socorro, New Mexico, to have them analyzed. And when we showed it to the gal who was going to operate the scanning electron microscope to examine it, she said, "Oh, nice piece of trinitite. Where did it come from?" "Never mind, just tell us what you find." We didn't tell her where it came from. Anyway, that sharp edge on the right, this is now looking into the edge under the magnification. This is about 5 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch thick piece. It comes from a pot, probably a water pot, up on a roof. That's why it got maximum exposure. And it's what we call the shoulder coming up to the neck. That high point is rising up the neck of the vessel, a water jar. Okay? So it's a shoulder rising up to the neck. That's what that high point is. Now, take a look at a couple of details on this. On the left, look at the edge. This surface got turned to glass. This is not glazed pottery. This was found in a sealed Middle Bronze Age context, dated 1650 BC. Glazing of pottery was introduced during the Islamic period in 600 AD. So it's not glazed. It's actual melted surface of this piece. And out of the 5 millimeters, about 1 millimeter got melted into glass. And it was melted enough that it actually started flowing. And if you look right here, you can see where the melt rolls around the broken edge right there. See it? You see the same thing up here, melted glass rolling around the edge. Right? The next 2 millimeters in thickness, the original clay of the pot is thermally darkened. And then this is the natural color of the clay of that pot. Okay, so think about that for a minute. You've got a 1/4 inch piece, 1/4 inch thick piece, that got hot enough to melt the surface, but didn't melt the whole thing into a blob. Hold that thought. So, under the electron microscope, what we found in there were melted zirconium crystals. Well, where's the pointer? There it is. Here's one that's expanded here. Here's another that's expanded over here. Melted zirconium crystal. Normally, it's a faceted crystal. These are not faceted. They've melted. Zirconium melts at approximately 2,000 degrees centigrade. All right, so multiply that times 9/5, and anyway, it's hot. It's hot. But you see these lines and these lines? That's a contaminated plane within the crystal. So it's got some contaminants in the crystal. It's not pure zirconium. It's got some contaminants in it. And along that fracture line in the crystal, what happened is it got hot enough that the crystal was going from a liquid state to a gas state. And those little tiny holes you see there, they're called vesicles. That's evidence of the crystal boiling. It's going from liquid to transitioning to the gas state. And it happens at that fracture line because the contaminants slightly lower the boiling point of the mineral. But that typically happens around 4,000 degrees centigrade. And if you're up at all on your knowledge of the surface of the sun is in that range of 4,000 degrees. Now, the corona gets up to 1,000,000 degrees. That's that gas plume around the sun. Gets up to 1,000,000. But the surface of the sun is about 4,000 degrees. That's how hot those crystals got. But remember, where were those crystals located? In that 1 millimeter thick glass layer, where those crystals in the clay of that sand got hot enough to melt and to actually boil, but the whole thing didn't melt down. That's suggesting temperatures far in excess of 4,000 degrees is what it was exposed to. but for a fraction of a second. It had to be that hot to melt it, that short a duration to not melt the whole thing down into a puddle of glass. Right? So that was an extremely hot blast front that came through. We've already talked about the concussive force, but there was heat with it. Now the heat, by the way, now, I could, if I go down too many rabbit holes, we'll never finish tonight. I'll save that for some other time. I'll talk about what goes on during the kind of destruction we're getting here, and we talk about the physics of it if you're really interested in it, but not tonight. Okay, here's another piece. Now notice the surface of this one. It's really rough. It didn't melt into a nice soft flow, but rather it's kind of rough. This was probably also a water jar full of water, and there was moisture inside the clay. So when it got exposed to the heat, as the clay of the pottery itself starts to melt and get into a plastic state, the water trapped inside this piece of clay instantly vaporizes. And it turned that piece of pottery basically into pumice. And that's what those little pits are you see. So as the water flashed to steam, it left all these holes behind, and then the thing instantly quenched and left you with that pumice-like texture. Here's another one, had even more water in it. Look at the size of those holes from the flash to steam of the water that the piece of pottery contained. Once again, really high temperatures happening very short. The melt's a little deeper on this thing. It was exposed to more heat, perhaps a little bit longer. All right, this is an interesting one. Focus on the bottom one for a minute. That's only about 1 centimeter. It's about as big as my thumbnail. It's a little chip of pottery. Notice the color. It's kind of green. That's the natural color of it. It is almost completely melted through, but not all the way. You see the top images? The one on the right is the outside of the one on the left. That's the inside the vessel versus outside. If you look at the one on the left, I don't know if you can see it from there, but there are lines, parallel lines going across it from left to right. Those are tool marks from the potter. This was a closed vessel, narrow neck. And he's down in there with a stylus or something while he's forming this pot on the wheel. He's got a stylus in his hand, and he's coming up, shaping it with his hand, running the stylus up the inside, and the stylus is making those circular rings going around the inside. That's what the backside of that bottom piece looks like. So we know it came from the same vessel. But this little chip, because it was so small, when it got exposed, and by the way, notice the main piece got blown far enough away and never melted. Doesn't show any signs of extreme heat. But that little piece was so small, it almost melted clear through. The only thing left to identify it and stop it from going to a blob was the fact that we can see the inside of the vessel. And apparently there was, again, enough moisture in it that it didn't melt all the way through. So again, we're talking about really extreme heat. This is an interesting thing. We call it a melt rock. It was found at a site called Talmweiss, which is a small tell about 8 kilometers southwest of us in the direction of the Dead Sea. We are northeast of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, the north end of the Dead Sea, is southwest from our site. Hold that thought for later. All right. This rock is about as big as my hand. It's about 10 centimeters long, about 5 centimeters wide, and about 4 centimeters thick. All right, so it's a pretty substantial piece. It consists of, the technical term is an agglomeration. In other words, things get fused together of three different agglomerations of minerals. And that's referred to as a lithology. In other words, what's the makeup of the stone? It's called a lithology in technical terms. Lithology A is the main bulk of the stone. It is quartz, sand crystals that in the turbulence of the blast, this is how we theorize this thing was formed. In the turbulence of the blast, much like Trinity site at Alamogordo, sucked up a volume of sand that in the heat of the turbulence, it starts to melt the quartz crystals to the point where they become plastic and sticky, and they start to glom together. You know, that technical term, glom, okay? Starts to glom together into a putty-like mass. Then there was some sandstone. That's lithology B on the left. It's brown in color instead of whitish. A bunch of sandstone got sucked up in the same way, and it starts to melt and bond together. And the two of these slam together in the air, become too heavy for the turbulence to support, and it falls down, and actually the bottom side of it, we can just see a little bit there, and it basically, like taking spaghetti and throwing it at a wall, it's stuck to a wall, a rock, or something. And while it's in that state, the heat is still going on, because it's a lot apparently closer, so the exposure was longer, just from the mass of it. While that was going on, the outer surface is continuing to melt, and it's actually starting to drip. See right here? It's actually starting to drip. There's your drip of melted glass, melted quartz crystal. Right there, starting to drip off. That point was hanging down. And then a third ball, also made of quartz crystal, falls and slams into it. And when we were looking at this, you can actually see where you've got the melted surface of lithology A, lithology C slams into it, and you can see where the glass of lithology A wicked up when this thing planted itself in it. And then at some point later, it fell off the wall, and 3,700 years later, we go walking by, and there it is sitting on the ground. So we don't have a good provenance for this. But there's no way that that could have been made by human industry during that period. In fact, there is no human industry in the key car that could produce that. So we're assuming that it was produced by the event. Okay? That's lithology A. We cut through it to look at it. You can see that the quartz crystal was melted into glass. And this is all fused quartz crystals, partially turned to glass in it. So this thing got hot, really hot, right? And now, under the scanning electron microscope, there's our good old friend, zircons. But look at the size of the holes, the fistules in it. This thing not only melted, it's actually starting to come together now, almost into a bead, and then it starts to boil, and you've got those big holes in it, those big fistules in it, because of the outgassing of it. Okay? Here's the sandstone end of it. This had a lot more water in it. And when the water flashed to steam, what did it create? Those nice pits in it, okay? And if you look really carefully, you can see there's little tiny brown beads lining all of those holes, which are actually melted sandstone that were in the vapor of the flash of steam that deposited out inside those holes. Really fascinating, to me anyway. Okay, microspherules. These are smaller than 1 millimeter. As they pan through here. These are individual grains of minerals, of sand, that got caught up in the air, melted, and because of surface tension, formed spheres before they quenched in the air as they rained out of the sky. Okay? Just remember those microspherules. Melted mud brick. I've got some samples of mud brick on the table. You can look at it later. These are chunks of mud brick. When the mud bricks were exploded, chunks flying through the air actually started to melt, turned to rock. We didn't have baked bricks. They were all air-dried mud brick, just like the adobe buildings you see in this part of the country. Air-dried mud bricks, but these have been partially melted and turned to stone. And they're very lightweight because of that. They're almost like pumice. This is roofing material. How did they make the roofs? Well, first you got the big beams. What do they call kivas? The big beams. And then you got smaller logs going across. And then they put straw. And I can never get this straight. Is it wad and dabble? Or, however they make it. Straw, mud, mixed and layered. And that's how they make floors for the second floor. That's how they make the roofs. So this is roofing material. Turned to stone. And the bottom pictures are showing the organics highlighted and colorized, the organics that were in the mixture of clay and organic straw and stuff like that. But what's really interesting, what is a plant structure made out of? Silicone. Yeah, you call it cellulose, but it's basically made out of silicone because the plants absorb the dissolved minerals from the sand and they use that to build the skeleton of the plant. Because of the heat, there's no organics left. What we have is the silicone skeleton of the plants left in there. There is no organics left in it. This is a piece of plaster, limestone plaster that was on a wall, got hot enough to melt. That's the melted surface of plaster. So, the evidence of extreme. Oh, okay, so I'll forgive the formatting here. It's a difference between my computer and his computer. Kind of messed up my contamination on the end there. Anyway, so we have evidence not only of high concussive force, extreme temperature, now we also have evidence of salt. Sorry, Pastor, but there is such a thing as too much salt. So if you heard his message this morning, you know what I'm talking about. If you didn't hear it, he'll explain it later. On the lower tell, I personally took soil samples that go through, from above, through, and below a layer of ash that we describe as the destruction layer. All right? And this is a plot of the salt content, actually salt and sulfate content, that we discovered in that soil. The reason why we went looking for this is that we would get to Tel el-Hammam, and if we would clear off a new patch of dirt, start digging, and go home that night, we come back the next morning and there's this white haze on the ground. And we soon realized what was happening is that there was salt in the ground. And as the temperature dropped at night, the humidity would come up and it would leach salt up to the surface and it would crystallize as a white haze. By the way, I see some of you are taking pictures. That's fine. Please do not post the pictures on social media. For your own use, that's okay. They are filming this. It is going to be available on YouTube. I'm not saying anything tonight that hasn't been published. I would just prefer you not post any pictures of this on social media. Let the YouTube video that they're producing here tonight do the talking for you. Point people to that. Okay? Good. Thank you. That was non-disclosure agreement. All right. So what we see on the left is going from sample, the top one is above the destruction layer, the bottom one is below the destruction layer. That peak, sample number 4, is the destruction layer. And what we're seeing is that if you just take a combined look at the salt and sulfates, we have 6% salt content in the destruction layer, and then it quickly tapers off down to 5, 4, and then 3. The bottom one is basically breaking down the salt content into its compositions, and you can't read that scale at the top. This is an eye chart. But it's basically each color band represents a different mineral in the salt. Sodium, calcium, whatever. I can't read them from here either. Potassium. Basically, that chemical composition is the composition of the water in the Dead Sea. That chemical composition of the salts that we found in the soil at Tel el-Hammam is identical to the composition of the salts that make the Dead Sea a Dead Sea. All right? Okay, the lower Tell is 120, I'm going to speak meters again, sorry. 154 meters below sea level being the Mediterranean Sea. The Dead Sea, at this period of time, in the Middle Bronze Age, was about 400 to 450 meters below sea level. Remember, we're on the far edge. We're about 14 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea. All right? So the Dead Sea is significantly lower. Now, on the upper Tell, there is salt contamination, but nowhere near this level. Okay? I'll explain why in a minute. But here's the important part about this. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, wheat will not germinate if the salt content of the soil exceeds 1.3%. We're at 6%. Barley will not germinate if the salt content exceeds 1.6%. We're at 6%. Wheat and barley, they're the two main cereal grains that are produced. Wheat, used for fine flour, the rich man's bread in that day and age. Barley, the poor man's flour, was used for the coarse bread. And you see the two talked about in Scripture. Okay? They couldn't grow after this event. They could not grow cereal grains. If you cannot grow cereal grains, you can't feed people, you can't feed livestock, you have no urban settlements. Ding, 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 ding. 600-year occupational hiatus. And I have a book that was recommended to me by actually my son's father-in-law, who is a soil scientist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And in that book, it was called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization. The author of that book, not my son's father-in-law, but the author of that book was writing about how in ancient cultures, as agriculture was starting to evolve in ancient Mesopotamia, they didn't know what they were doing, but they were just farming the snot out of that river bottom, right? And they didn't know fertilizers. They knew they had to water when the waters were low, so they would pump water up. And over the course of time, they would deplete the nutrients in the soil. And with their irrigation techniques, eventually they would raise the salt levels in the soil to the point where their production went in the tank. And when that happened, they just pick up stakes, move somewhere else, and do the same thing all over again. He did a study. How long does it take soil to recover when human agricultural processes are depleting the soil and contaminating it with salt? Well, it depends on where you are. But in a dry desert climate like the Kikar, it can take centuries for it to recover. And while those centuries are going on, you still have the Jordan River doing its annual up and down. And during the rainy seasons, more silt washing down from the upper plateaus. You have the spring rains and the fall rains washing out the soil. But it took 600 years for the soil to recover enough so that in Iron Age 1, they could start growing cereal grains 5 kilometers north of us. And another 100 years later, they could start growing cereal grains again at Tal al-Hammam. And Tal al-Hammam, in the Iron Age 2, the time of Solomon, became a store city, one of those unnamed store cities for grain. And we see evidence of Iron Age silos being dug down through our rampart walls, sometimes right through the foundations on the upper Tell. And we've identified at least 24 of them, and we haven't found all of them. We've excavated a few, but we've identified at least 24 because they're stone-lined. They drilled down. Silos, we go up, they went down, lined them with stones, and that's where they'd store their grain from the field. They had a big warehouse on top and a garrison to protect it, and an administrative building on top during the Iron Age in order to oversee the distribution of the grains. So maybe we're one of those unnamed store cities of Solomon. We don't know. There are 3 other kings who are also credited with having built store cities. We may be one of theirs. But we do know that when when Israel was taken out of the land, we went offline. They came in, they emptied that warehouse. We excavated a massive warehouse, multi-chambered warehouse. We found one broken storage jar. The whole place was empty. And the scripture very interestingly describes when those conquests were taking place, they emptied the temple treasury, they emptied all the storehouses, and then they destroyed them. And that's what we find, a destroyed warehouse with nothing in it from the Iron Age, sitting on top of all of our Middle Bronze Age destruction underneath it. Okay, so physical evidence that we've gathered at Tel al-Hammam thus far, and from what I've read and what we've studied in the survey reports and the excavation reports of sites in the area, all point to the same phenomenon taking place. A highly concussive thermal event occurred, wiped them out. Salt, topsoil, gone. Subsoil contaminated with Dead Sea salts. Can't grow crops, nobody home. I see a question.
Any evidence of nuclear?
No. We're talking about a destruction event that took place in 1650 BC. No nuclear.
Yeah, God.
Hmm? No. There's no radioactivity there. He doesn't need it. He doesn't need it. So, from what we've gathered, I talked about the subsoil already. Long occupational hiatus. We've got at least a theory now and an explanation of why. So, I already said this. One God created all things, who uses his creation to accomplish his purpose. So what might have God used? I discount any notion of God being a cosmic magician who just goes zap because he doesn't like anything. I don't buy that. He uses his creation to accomplish his purpose. So what did he use? My engineer in me asks. So here's the new theory about what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. Chelyabinsk, Russia, February 15th, 2013. We were in Jordan when this happened. That's an exploding meteor coming in, lighting up the sky, caught on over 400 dash cams. That's the damaged footprint of Chelyabinsk. And what we know is that over 6,000 buildings had the windows blown out of them, flying glass everywhere. All right, 1,600 people sought medical attention, 120 of them admitted, but nobody died, luckily. The energy released was equivalent to 500 kilotons, 500,000 tons of TNT at a blast altitude of about 12 kilometers. By comparison, the bombs that were dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were only 17 kilotons at a blast altitude of approximately 1 kilometer. Okay, this is big, but not the biggest we know about in human experience. Tunguska, Siberia, June 30th, 1908. I can't read the number from this distance. 80 million trees blown down, knocked down, splayed out radially outward from the epicenter. Directly under the epicenter, we find a standing trees, all of the limbs stripped off of it. Large enough, that footprint, to engulf the entire city of Rome. If that had happened over Rome, there would be no Rome, there would be no St. Peter's Basilica, there would be nothing. This diagram shows the burn footprint underneath. You've got that inner circle in red, that was flash burn. You had near total destruction there, except for the trees directly underneath standing straight up. But the burn that continued afterwards spread out. It's not but you had more trees still laid out, stripped of branches, all the way out to the perimeter. That's kind of what it looked like. This was estimated, and the estimates vary from 10 megatons, million tons, to 30 million tons of TNT at an altitude of 10 kilometers. This was big event, 1908. So, for more than a decade, there's a team of scientists that have been supporting me in the research that we've been doing on the material evidence of destruction. And they basically set all the protocols and defined all the protocols for finding what you need to find in order to determine whether you have an airburst event or a meteor impact and what goes on. They've basically identified all the protocols, and all of these protocols have revealed that the proxies, the physical evidence of an airburst event, these are what we call as the signature markers of an airburst event. They're all being found at Tal el-Hammam. Some of them you've seen tonight. The microspherules, the melted pottery, the evidence of burn. You've seen some of those tonight. When I wrote my dissertation for my PhD in 2015, I only had 6 lines of evidence. We now have 17 to which you can add another 6 lines of evidence coming right out of the scriptures that we've validated. All right? So we have 23 lines of evidence right now. We've got the hardest one that we're dealing with, that we're getting pushback on, has been what we call the directionality, the evidence of directionality. And the arguments are being made by people who are not archaeologists, have never been to an archaeological site, do not know how to interpret photographs, have never seen them, and they're challenging us on this, and we've got a major presentation in the works for November that's going to be made up in Boston by Dr. Collins, and then we'll be publishing that as a paper probably by the end of the year. So I can't say anything more about what that evidence is because it's not published yet, but it's definitive. I mean, there's no arguing with it once you see it, and that's all I can say. So the signature markers include, sir. The biggest things that you find in asteroids are going to be high ratios of platinum and a high platinum-palladium ratio. It's called, both of those are rare earth elements. They're called rare earth elements because on Earth they're really rare. Typically what we see in an airburst location or in a meteor impact location is a 600% spike in platinum and a corresponding spike in the platinum-palladium ratio as a result of that. So lead, yeah, but lead's also very common on Earth. So where does the lead come from? Does it come from the asteroid or does it come from Earth? It's too common on Earth to be a proxy for an airburst. But the platinum, and other minerals as well, is one of the proxies that tell us we're dealing with an asteroid, because asteroids have a much higher concentration of platinum in them, but it's very rare in Earth itself. But good question. Thank you. Okay, so high levels of platinum, typically 600% above normal, high platinum-palladium ratio, and I've already said that, not common on Earth, common in asteroids. All right, more signature markers of an airburst. A high incidence of scoria. Scoria, let me define that term. Everybody familiar with smelting metallic ores? That scum that floats up to the top, that they skim off and throw away. That's scoria. Okay, it's a slag that they skim off the top. It's called, the technical term is scoria. And we have a lot of those scoria-like objects, or SLOs, that we see in an airburst or impact event. And typically what that consists of, remember when it hits the ground or you get an airburst, you're throwing a bunch of junk up in the air that's going to be superheated, get kind of plastic, and it'll fuse together. Now, that melt rock that I showed you was 3 very distinct but uniform agglomerations of sand. Most of the time, you just get a bunch of junk thrown up that gets kind of loosely bonded together, and it looks like slag, and you find it laying on the ground. So we find, a high incidence of that, and that would also include the spherules that I talked about. Yes, sir?
Is there evidence of cavitation at Sodom and Gomorrah? Any more depression?
We have one feature on the upper tell that I'm personally excavating now, the last time we were in the field, and I'll be continuing that this year, that we think might be a possible micrometeor crater. In other words, with this airburst, a big enough fragment survived that destruction to hit our site and put a bullseye right on the south end of the upper tell. That's all I know at this point. Hopefully we'll learn more. The odds of me finding definitive fragments are between slim and none, but I'm going to look anyway.
But no satellite images showing anything?
This is the only place. In fact, you can see it if you look carefully enough on Google Earth. But we also have a 3D model that was made with a drone in 2018 that shows this feature very, very clearly. And it puzzled us for years because we didn't know what it was until we saw that 3D model. So, our conclusion is, since we're finding all of these signature markers of an airburst event at Tal al-Hammam, what's the natural conclusion you draw? The rock and fire that fell from the heavens, sent by God, was probably an asteroid fragment. He's got millions of them up there. Snick, all he has to do is vector one here. What do you think Chelyabinsk was? That was an asteroid, an Earth-crossing asteroid, and Earth was in the wrong place at the right time, boom. Yeah. And what I believe we have in the Scripture is a true narrative representation in very condensed form of an eyewitness account of an exploding meteor fragment that took out an entire civilization in the 650 square kilometers of the Kikar. Sir?
Away from Tel El-Hammam,
Yes?
do you see the directionality being different? Is that as a zero?
I do not have an answer for that question because we have only excavated Tal el-Hammam. The other three sites that have been excavated, they weren't looking for this. So there's no discussion of any directionality evidence in what they found. Now, that late bronze gap in the occupation history of the region, the excavator we give him the credit for the term late bronze gap because he was doing Tel Nimrine about 5 kilometers to our northwest. That we think was Adma. That's the one that's about 1/4 the size of Tel el-Hammam. When he started his excavation in the first season, he said, we've got a site here that we think is, maybe Bronze Age to Iron Age, blah, blah, blah. And that's all he said about it. The second season, he says, well, no, it goes back to the Chalcolithic, in other words, the Copper Stone Age, and it goes into the Iron Age. But we're not sure about the Late Bronze Age yet. In his third report, he said, this site actually goes back to the Neolithic period. We have a definite gap in the occupation that spans the entire Late Bronze Age, and then it was reoccupied during the Iron Age, just like Tal el-Hammam. Now, he documented that, offered no explanation for it why, but we went to Tal el-Hammam, because he was done his work before we started. When we got to Tal el-Hammam, we were looking for that late bronze gap. We were anticipating it. And by golly, we found it. Yes, ma'am?
I have two questions. First, are you reserving some of your excavation for when technology makes great strides, new technology?
We are trying to learn as much as we can, as quickly as we can, because we have no guarantees from year to year that we'll ever be able to return. Understand that we are excavating in a Muslim country. Now, Jordan is a very, if we have any allies in the Muslim world, we have Jordan. I mean, Jordan is a friend of the United States. They love the United States, very supportive of the United States. And in Jordan, you still have Christian enclaves, especially at Madaba. So you still have Christian enclaves, and they get along really, really well. But within the Department of Antiquities, who we work by permit issued by them in Jordan each year, about half of the people in the Department of Antiquities are totally opposed to our identification of Tal el-Hammam as being the most logical candidate for the city of Sodom. Because they are afraid if we ever find that Chamber of Commerce Welcome to Sodom sign, it will give the Jews claim to the land. So about half of the people in the Department of Antiquities are really opposed to what we're doing. Of the other half, about half of that other half, about a quarter of them, are neutral. They don't care. And the other quarter agree with they are people of the book. Okay, the Quran is based on the Old Testament. They are people of the book. And so that other quarter have studied Dr. Collins' analysis of the text and the work that we've been doing, and they say, Collins might very well be right about this. So that's what we're fighting every year. Now, as new technology becomes available, absolutely we grab it. The analysis of the materials and the minerals that we have here, That's all modern technology. That we did the first scanning electron microscope in 2002. We now are working with much more powerful microscopes at the University of North Carolina in Raleigh that were made available by the team of scientists that came on board with me in 2014 to do this materials analysis. So we've got access now to stuff. Other proxies that we found and published in a paper in October, we had to go to University of Oregon to get these verified. It's called shock quartz, which is, again, another lecture, but I'll leave that alone. But it's another signature marker, another proxy. In fact, it is the proxy of an airburst event. That although this group that are supporting my work here have been studying this for almost 20 years, they've never seen shocked quartz before. They knew it existed. They've never found it in any of their sites, and they've gathered material from all over the world, from Northern Asia, across Europe, across North America, Central America, Western South America. They've never found shocked quartz. And we're finding lots of it. And that was really the last thing we found that delayed our paper by 8 months, because we found that we're ready to submit for publication with 16 proxies. And all of a sudden, we spotted shocked quartz. We had to get it verified up at Portland. COVID, broken machinery, couldn't get repair parts. 8 months later, we published our paper with that in it, yes.
You mentioned that there were groups that were opposing you for the reasons you mentioned, but are there groups of people who do not believe in God, maybe motivated by Satan, that are working against what you're doing?
Short answer, absolutely yes.
And has your life been threatened?
My life has not been threatened, but boy, have I been excoriated in certain quarters, and so is Dr. Collins. Dr. Collins gets nailed all the time for his Sodom identification. I get nailed. Yeah, I know it's really late. My wife's back there raising. I'm like 15 minutes over where I intended to quit. I won't be offended if you want to leave, but I'll keep answering questions as long as you're interested. Or I get thrown out by Pastor Stan, whichever comes first. I get shot at primarily by evangelicals on one hand, because I'm an engineer. I'm approaching this project as a scientist, trying to understand not only what God did, but how he did it. And so somehow, if I'm right, well then, I've just provided a natural explanation for the destruction of Sodom. Who needs God? So I'm getting, and I already told you, I'm a theologian. I believe in one God who created all things, who uses his creation to accomplish his purpose. I'm just trying to figure out how he did it. But I'm getting accused of trying to write God out of the equation. And this is coming from the evangelical camp. So, you can't win. Okay. She's heard my talk before, and I didn't cover this time. All right. That was my first clue, personal clue on directionality. She's asking, can I explain more the reason for the high salt content? Okay. And why I claim it's an indicator of directionality. Okay, hold it. I'll get to it. Standing on top of the Tell, the Dead Sea is to our southwest. 240 degrees on the compass. It's to our southwest. All right? The only way I can explain that high salt content on the lower Tell is that, for me, ground zero of the airburst was located over or near the north end of the Dead Sea. Because when an airburst occurs over water, it sucks up a tremendous volume of water. Some of that gets pushed across the landscape at roughly the speed of sound, okay, as a tsunami. The rest of it flashes to steam and vapor, and it gets pushed on the blast front as superheated brine spray. Now, we've got enough salt contamination on the upper Tell that I think the upper Tell was subjected to the brine spray, but I think that tsunami effect washed over the lower Tell, hence the high concentration of salt. And that's following, I didn't want to get into the physics of an airburst, but I'll say one more thing. What happens in an airburst? First of all, when the thing explodes, all of that energy gets converted to light. It's like a mini sun in our atmosphere all of a sudden. Really, really close mini sun. And so you get this radiant energy traveling at the speed of light that incinerates everything in its path. Followed at the speed of sound, the concussive blast front comes through, bowls everything over, and you get this high overpressure, which creates all of this destruction. And then in the wake, you get a backblast created by the vacuum that's behind the blast front. So you have all of this going on. So the first thing you get is that intense solar-like radiation that incinerates everything, and that's where your high heat comes from, traveling at the speed of sound, at the speed of light. You get the blast front traveling at the speed of sound, like you see a flash of lightning. Then you hear the rumble of thunder. The flash of lightning is traveling at the speed of light. That's why you see it so soon. But the thunder is traveling at the speed of sound, so it's delayed. Same thing with an airburst event. Okay? Your question, sir.
If you've determined directionality of this site, if you could find directionality from another site, because there were more than one cities, using triangulation, could you almost come back to, I know it's a very small...
The short answer to your question, absolutely we could, but we don't have access to that information because those sites have been excavated, they weren't looking for it, they didn't record it, and we can't go back.
So none of the other sites that are in the little city-states around Sodom, have you found where they are, and have any of those been excavated?
Yeah, remember that picture I showed you, the middle brown thing? We know where all those sites are.
Do they show directionality so that you've got 2 points to triangulate from?
Only 3 others have been excavated. None of those archaeologists that predated us were looking for directionality. Therefore, they never discovered it. They weren't looking for it. They didn't record it. There's nothing in their excavation reports that gives us any clues about directionality. That's kind of a new concept coming from us in our evidence. That too. I'm getting the wave from...
I've discovered something.
What's that?
I know why the salt sea's salt.
Okay?
Lot's wife was walking along, she turned around and looked back, turned into a pillar of salt, big wind, and then talking about it, blowed her right out there in the water.
It's a good theory, Pastor, but I think you have the cart before the horse. I'm sorry?
What led you in the direction of looking for directionality?
Salt in the soil. That's what led me. And then all of us as archaeologists working together started to recognize in the destruction matrix a southwest to northeast movement in direction. And that has been, once that idea took hold, we've been looking for more evidence of that, and we're finding it significantly in the destruction matrix. And it's a single event destruction matrix, all tied to this event. Oh, yeah, well, I didn't want to go there. Let me just put it this way. The short form, it was a Tunguska-class event. We figure at a minimum, it would be equivalent to a 10 megaton, which is the low end of the 10 to 30 megaton of Tunguska. At a minimum, it could actually be less than that, because if our event was lower than the 10 kilometers in terms of where it exploded in the atmosphere than Tunguska, it could be a lot less than that, because the force of the energy is 1 over r squared. So the further you get from it, the lower the energy. The closer you are, the more intense the energy. So we just refer to it as a Tunguska class event. Okay, so 10.
Follow you so that we know when the YouTube video comes out?
That's up to the guy up in the booth, because it's going to be a video put out by the church. Okay, it's being put out by the church. They recorded this tonight. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, on your map,
way far to the south. Petra, if you were to look at the region, you see the Gulf of Aqaba, and you have the Gulf of Aqaba. Petra is just northeast of the top end of the Gulf of Aqaba. So it's about 5 hours, 6 hours by bus southeast of us. Yes.
Let me say one other thing. If you can, would like to help Phillip. He's going back for another 6 to 8 weeks.
We're doing an 8-week season coming up.
Interested in helping him with some expenses. We'll have a bucket back here. He's been awesome, and we thank him very much for coming and being with us tonight. Taking of his time, and thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, we have to let these people go home. We need to let you go home.
I hope you dream about my soul.
I actually addressed that in Appendix E of my book. I have a theory about that too. It's in Appendix E of the book. Yes. If we are correct in our identification of neighborhood sites, it's about 1 kilometer to our northwest. It's a very small conical tell. Adma's about 7. Yeah, when you look at this.
Well, when you look at this on the book, it looks